Hi, Leah. If you can turn off your camera for now.
Monica, you can begin.
Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Monica Jahangir Chaudhary. I am the co-chair of the NGO Committee for Social Development. And on behalf of the committee, it's my pleasure and honor to welcome you all to the third panel of our first ever virtual civil society forum. The Civil Society Forum reflects the themes of our Civil Society Declaration on the priority theme of the UN Commission for Social Development. And to this day, over 600 organizations and individuals have already signed our declaration and its 10 recommendations. If you want to add your voice and your signature, you can still do that by clicking on the sign-on link that will be shared in the chat box. Tomorrow is the Civil Society Forum closing session, and you are all invited to join us at this closing session by registering in the link that will also be shared on the chat box. Two more technical points before we start today's panel. We have interpretation on today's panel towards French and Spanish. So to access interpretation, please look below at the bottom of your screen in the Zoom bar. You will see an icon with a little globe saying interpretation. And if you click on it, you can then choose French or Spanish. And we would like to thank you, to thank our interpreters for their services. The second technical point is when we'll start the time for Q&A. You can either ask your question in the Q&A box that is also at the bottom of your screen, or you can ask your question in the chat box. And we will make sure that your question is either read by our moderator or that you are brought on stage with your camera on so you can ask your question. If you want to ask your question in French or in Spanish, you can also do that. Our interpreters will interpret for you back in English. Before we start the panel and before I hand over to Anita, I would like to invite you all to watch a beautiful video from grassroots voices from all over the world as they share the impact of digital technology in their lives. Thank you.
Digital technologies allow us to crowd map anonymous stories of sexual and gender-based violence on our platform Safe City. This is important because it allows us to bridge the data gap that exists due to the culture of silence that surrounds this kind of violence.
Bonjour, je m'appelle Doris, je suis militante à Lyon. Je vais vous parler d'une des failles numériques que je rencontre. Étant pupille de l'État, je ne possède pas les dates de naissance de mes géniteurs, ce qui est une condition pour faire une demande d'acte de naissance en ligne.
Digital technology has allowed for continued relationships with the private sector. Digital technology has provided ways to expand the work we do nationally to fight against human trafficking. 数字技术使与私营部门的关系得以持续发展。数字技术为扩大我们在全国范围内打击人口贩卖的工作提供了途径。
We, the Sisters of St. Joseph of Lyon, Shantinidaya community, presents to you the impacts of digital technologies. Virtual education for some. No smartphone, no laptop, no network for millions. Increase of screen time. Physical illness and mental depression. Instant communication worldwide. Lack of interpersonal relationship. Work from home for some. Job loss for many. E-banking and e-business. Increase of cyber crimes. Convenient online shopping. Deprivation for small-scale industries and platform vendors. We hope for just and a better society.
Welcome back. We hope you enjoyed this video, and I see that we have now reached almost 170 participants in this session, so welcome you all. I will now hand over to our moderator of the day, Anita Gurumurthy. Welcome, Anita. Anita is a founding member and executive director of IT for Change, where she leads research collaborations and projects in relation to the network society with a focus on governance, democracy, gender justice, and also relevant to today's conversation, internet governance, data, and surveillance. Anita, we are very excited to have you as a moderator. I will hand it over to you now, and I also call the panelists on stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Monica. Honored to be here. And a very warm welcome to everybody to the Civil Society Forum 2021 of the UN Commission for Social Development. Today's theme is digital technologies and good governance, a theme that I think is at the heart of the future of democracy, and some would opine is at the heart of the present of democracy. And as governments endeavor to ensure that no one is left unconnected, so that no one is left behind, there are a lot of questions about what kind of connectivity matters, what is the digital paradigm we aspire to, so that there is enough for everyone's need, and as Amartya Sen conceptualizes, more than enough to achieve a flourishing of human capability. This connection between technology and human capability, a flourishing human capability, is not automatic, and it is to this theme that our very distinguished and eminent guest today will speak. So without ado, I'd like to invite Vitsevan Ranspeak, CEO of Citizen Lab, Emmeline Siale Ilolahia, Executive Director, Pacific Islands Association of NGOs, Gert Auvart, Deputy Permanent Representative of Estonia to the United Nations, and Leah Dinger, Government Industry Advisor for IBM. So I invite you, we'd say, to take on the mother of all questions. How can digital technology be put to the service of citizen participation? I invite you to speak to this question from the experience of Citizen Lab.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, first of all, for inviting me and giving me the chance to answer the mother of all questions. So my name is Vitsevan Ranspeak. I am the founder and the CEO of Citizen Lab, which is an online citizen engagement platform that is now used by over 200 governments worldwide, mainly in Europe, but also in the United States. And I want to tell you a bit more about, maybe before telling more about Citizen Lab, I want to tell a bit more about how we got started. So 5 years ago, I was still a student, and in Brussels, I live in Brussels, by the way, and I had ideas for my neighborhood, and I wanted to change things, but I couldn't actually find a way to easily do so. So of course, I attended a town hall meeting and I met 5 other people on that Tuesday night, but it's not really how we're going to get people engaged at scale, how we're going to get youngsters involved in local politics. So that's why we started Citizen Lab, which is a digital democracy platform that consists of 2 pillars. So we have top-down projects, basically initiated by mainly the cities or the government. So that could be a mobility plan or a strategic plan. What we see these days that happens a lot is participatory budgeting. So basically that is that you have a fund for the city and that you distribute like funds to different community projects in the different neighborhoods. It's something that's really used a lot. But next to these, let's call them top-down projects in which citizens give inputs by sharing ideas and having discussions and voting, there's also the option to engage from the bottom up. And that's something that I want to just stress that is really important, that citizens can also set the agenda, that they shouldn't only participate in the discussions that are already presented by the city, but they can actually decide themselves, hey, look, this is something that we care about. This is something that we want to see discussed. So let me maybe take one example to illustrate a bit how that works in practice. So let's take the example of the city of Nuuk in Greenland. What they did at the end of last year in the light of Black Lives Matter is they had a public deliberation on whether the statue of a Danish missionary from the 16th century, whether his statue in the middle of the city, whether that should be removed, yes or no. And what happened next is that actually people would add arguments, pro, cons, to either removing it or keeping it. And they are actually asked to postpone judgment, to first listen to each other, to have argumentation together. And then only at the end, there is the voting. So in this case, they decided in the end to actually keep the statue. But that's one practical example. And to just finish here, this opening question, I think what's really important for citizens to engage online is that it's, first of all, easy to use. Secondly, and more importantly, that it's meaningful, that it's about something that they really care about and they are given a certain degree of influence in the final decision. And lastly, something that I want to share is that during COVID, we've seen that more and more face-to-face discussions are also brought online. That's something I'm really excited about, because participation used to be commenting and voting and posting ideas online. But the whole aspect of having face-to-face deliberation and empathizing with the other's perspective is really important. And that's something that we've seen over the past few months, that more and more discussions are taking online. And that again is hopefully going to enlarge the pool of participants, the pool of citizens who engage online.
Thank you so much. Actually, that gives a wonderful segue to really talk about, meaningful agenda setting. That is really a takeaway for us. And Here, I'd like to invite Gert to talk to how the government of Estonia has envisioned and implemented its digital infrastructure for this kind of meaningful agenda setting, and also for citizens to have access to public services. Gert, over to you.
Thank you very much, and good morning from New York, and good afternoon and good evening to people around the globe. It's wonderful to be here, and I thank you very much for this opportunity. I would immediately build up on what Vitsa said. He made a reference to Greenland and Nuuk, and well, Estonia in that sense is similar. It started snowing around Christmas in Estonia, and at the moment it hasn't stopped, and it's about a meter of snow everywhere in Tallinn and elsewhere in Estonia. So you could say that one reason that why we decided to go digital was that there's just too much snow outside to queue in a line to get a service anywhere. But that, of course, being humor, the main reasons in reality were that Estonia regained its independence in 1991. And when we started off, we were extremely poor, and we needed to get the state functioning in a way that all the services that any modern state provides are there and provided. And for us, the solution was to go digital, to take the services online instead of opening up these old school bureaucratic machineries that exist in so many places. And eventually, I would say it paid off. So it wasn't sort of to be cool or to achieve a status as a digital country. It was rather from practical origins, practical needs to be able to provide these services. And the first service with one of the first services with which Estonia started was income tax and declaration of taxes in the early 2000s. We decided to put that online. And what a government can do in such a scenario is a government cannot tell its citizens what to do, but the government can sort of softly persuade and use these soft power measures to try to guide in the right direction. And in our case, it was the tax declaration, that everyone was given the opportunity to declare their taxes online, but they could also continue with the old school, come bring it on paper, queue in line. It was up to the person. The only difference was that if you declared it online, you would get your funds or the taxes that you had overpaid back a few months sooner. And miraculously enough, immediately people started doing it online. So you have to sort of give some sort of an impetus, some sort of a motivation to the people to use this. And once this system had been working for a few years, money in people's lives is quite high up the list of things when you consider importance of things. So if you trust your money with these services, if you trust the online banking system, if you trust the taxes declaration online, why not trust other services as well? So this is how the snowball started rolling. And then we needed these governance tools. And in Estonia, one of the main, so there are several cornerstones of our sort of digital ecosystem, but one of the main cornerstones is a safe and secure digital identity for every individual, every person. And this, the main objective here, or how it actually can function, is that it has to be one identity in all the systems. It cannot be that you as an individual are under one code or one number in the library, another number, another code in the hospitals, another code, another number in the banks, another code, another number in the police. This is not connected. It has to be somehow connected. It has to be one secure system. There are different options worldwide. And for us, we use both our national identity card, we use a mobile ID, we use a smart ID. There are several different options. It's always safe to have variants, so that if something happens with one, you have another option that still functions. So this is one secure electronic identity. And second, there has to be a secure data exchange layer. And we've been utilizing our own system from the early 2000s. Our system is called X-Road. It's now being implemented worldwide in tens of countries. It's getting more and more each year. The most recent country that started using it is Mexico. And this basically provides a platform for it's a distributed system. It's not one single system. It's a distributed system, which provides a platform for secure data exchange. And these sort of are the backbones on which our system is built. And I'm gladly ready to answer any questions or to bring the discussion to any of these topics. It's wonderful to be with you here all. All the best.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kurt. Indeed, very inspiring, of course. Like all democratic governments, I'm sure, Estonia only wants to get better. But I think for many other governments, and as you pointed out, many governments are still trying to look at these cornerstones, these building blocks, and trying to learn. I'd like to turn to Emmeline to ask a question of the Global South, about a developing country context. And how can governments with infrastructural challenges, quite the opposite of Estonia, work with civil society to make the ideal of participatory democracy a reality? So how do you make the last mile the first priority? Emmeline, over to you.
Thank you. It's a privilege and an honor to be in this platform. I feel like I'm very far away, early morning, connecting to the rest of the world. Uh, for the Pacific Islands community, a lot of our majority of our countries are still very young in our democracy. And so participatory democracy is still a learning experiences for us, and let alone civil society sector is still very much a learning where we are very small, very communal. So the whole online, we are faced with some cultural challenges as well, where we are mostly preferred face to face, because that's how we had always been the way of life for us. The infrastructure challenges where access is still an issue, availability of the services, let alone the cost of online access is still very much challenging. When we talk about how we see participatory democracy, how our citizens are being able to participate online, we still see the challenges of the older population, disability, where online devices are still not available in some of our communities. So you still see the inequality that are existing. When we recognize that a lot of our government services are moving to be online, we ask the questions of, is that for the convenience of who? And you realize that a lot of our government are just looking at that as something that is convenient to them, is cost effective to their budget, to go online rather than doing consultations face to face, to make sure that we go from community to community to make sure that our citizens are participating. But the other interesting reflections as well is that when we recognize accountability and transparency, and I'm talking from a perspective of a budget, public finance management perspective, that some of our civil society are pushing for, because it allows citizens to participate in the public budget space. Um, they look at it as that, just put it up on website, putting it out on online, and they think that that's transparency. But no, transparency and accountability is much more than that. It's about the context. It's about how you make it simple so citizens are able to understand, able to participate in terms of engaging, able to be having dialogue, asking questions. And so we miss those kind of interactions when it comes to online in participating governance and getting our citizens at different level, disability. But then we see the young people are much more active then. Yeah, but then how do you balance that? Because you often find that when young people are more active in those spaces, they often miss the indirections of looking at different perspective. Yeah, where you have a face-to-face, you would have a lot more patience to listen to the older generation's perspective and view. Where in the online platform, you're much more open to project your own thinking and very less considering what the other perspective. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think you've actually posed very critical questions at the heart of democracy in terms of, ideas of the liberal individual who has rights and claims, and the ideas of a communitarian approach, which really requires us to understand culture also as being at the center of democracy, and how digital paradigms and approaches can really address both, right? So this, I think, is a profound observation. I will move to Leah now and ask an important question about text solutionism, right? That is something, as Gert pointed out, there can never be digital by diktat. You really have to build digital through trust. And in that context, the question for you, Leah, is what principles should inform the process of standard setting for digitally delivered public services? What, in your experience, comes across as something that's outside of solutionism, something that's outside of convenience, as Emmeline put it?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Anita, for the introduction and the question. Thank you all to the audience. The good morning from Texas, and obviously good afternoon, good evening. We've got global participants. It always excites me to join and have conversation with those from agencies, organizations, and those that are interested in health and human services and are serving the public today. Prior to joining IBM, I had a very rich career in social work and worked in the field for over 20 years with children and families, providing direct services to those in need. And of course, as you know, if you're an NGO or an agency, you know that that will cross-span a number of other issues that we are really charged in solving. I also want to welcome those on the call that are from the IT industry, as I know there may be some participants out there as well. And that's where, for the past 6 years, I have spent my career as a social worker and really tackling some of these challenges for how the exact, the things that Emily was bringing to light, those questions or something every day that we are pondering and learning to solutions. So bringing us all together on one platform is really incredible. I'm excited about this opportunity because this is what's needed: conversation, discussion, bringing those two worlds together. It's always said, what does such a human profession have to do with technology? Human profession is all about face-to-face interaction. It's about getting into the lives of those you work with and really understanding their needs and solving their problems. It's a very human touch, high emotional and profession. And then IT, of course, it's, most people will think of it as, it being something that distances or creates a barrier to those populations. But in fact, if we have more voices to elevate into the conversation, we can see that those things can come together seamlessly. So let me actually start out with answering Anita's question with a story. And what I share today is from experience as being a social worker and from working for a large IT corporation. And these are obviously my, my opinions and my experiences. But it's sort of a tale of two clients. And this will get to answer the question of the principles that we should be looking at. How can governments be responsive to the needs of individuals in a digital platform? And so Let me start out by saying the first client that we went to were in Health and Human Services. It was an agency that wanted to deliver and open up the opportunity for individuals in need for food benefits and emergency medical care benefits. And as we all know, there's typically lengthy application processes associated with that. And then in addition, working with marginal populations, they may have a myriad of issues, such as transportation issues, childcare issues. They may have some language issues, there, a number of things. But this client was very excited about the fact that a year prior that they had actually put the application process online. And of course, that sounds really exciting. That gives more people access to the applications from their home, kind of removes some of those barriers to applying. And so they were really excited about doing so. However, a year later, they actually had hardly any traffic to the site. And they came to us with questions of, what can we do? We spent a lot of money, not just about money, but we really, really want to reach our citizen populations. And so, likewise, the second client was a client that from the very start involved those end users, those clients in the process of designing an experience that would meet their needs. And so from the start, there, were certainly, the eye or the keen eye and what kind of technologies would help achieve the outcome for a better user experience for those applying for benefits. But the technology was there, but really that was sort of put behind. The first things that were done was bring those people to the table. Let's hear those voices, the voices of those that are experiencing homelessness. Let's hear the voices of those that maybe just lost their job and they need some immediate benefits. Let's understand their situation more. And so bringing those voices early on into the process is a very keen principle, because they found themselves a year later with over 70% of applications were being filed online. A reduction in foot traffic within the offices of workers that oftentimes would be hours of a sit and wait time in an office setting to get an appointment and to have your interview, that was cut drastically. Benefits were received more rapidly. And as a result, they were also getting, obviously, the benefits needed into the hands of the citizens much quicker, or those in need much quicker. So I would say from the very start, involving those, what we call stakeholders, or your end users, those that, whatever you're designing for, whoever's the recipient of that, you need to involve their voice often from the start. And then throughout that process, as new technology is rolled out, you continue to involve them. You continue to test out your ideas with them before you even put it into production.
Thank you, Leah. Easier said than done, citizens at the table. And I think this takes me to the second round that I would like to have somewhat of a rapid fire, because we'd also want to have the engagement of so many different organizations who have come to attend this webinar. So we just about have 9 to 10 minutes. So perhaps, about a 2-minute response from each of you. I'd like to turn to you, Gert, to really talk about where Leah left us. How do you bring together technological design and participatory democracy so it can work in tandem?
Well, thanks a lot, and this discussion is really interesting. Before I touch on this, perhaps I'll actually turn to what Emmeline referred to, and it really touched me, the idea of how the sort of this no one left behind approach, and how we can how the government can handle this. Bringing everyone on board, and while bringing the services on board, that it's not only convenient for the governments but also for the population. And the answer, in my opinion, and also in our experience, is education. So we started this program. It was called Tiger Leap already in the late 90s, but now there are newer and newer programs. So basically, it started off by the government physically buying and installing in school computer labs, and then creating these programs to educate from early on, and simultaneously to reach the elderly. So these village centers, or libraries, or local municipality centers, there would be rooms where there would be a free of charge access to the people, and also then training on how to use these new systems and these new platforms. So in the sense, if you create all these new services, you as government also have to ensure that the people have the free of charge access at first, even maybe limited in the beginning, but still free of charge access, and the relevant education to do this. And to your second question with regard to what Leah was saying, the whole system in my country works in a public-private partnership. I mean, this is how this trust is created. What I started with, for us, the trust federations, the services, banks and financial sector not necessarily immediately trust the government, but if you do these services together, if you create these semi-private, semi-public companies who will overrun the overview and have an overview of how these systems work, then this sort of creates the trust and then the participation of the civil society in these discussions and decision-making processes. If you provide them a link, a opportunity to engage, then this also is an element to build this trust. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I take away that already, I think the existing network of libraries and the fact that there was emphasis, on making sure that people felt comfortable becoming digital was an important strategy. And that itself went a long way in establishing trust. So Leah, to go back to you on that, especially when you design for marginalized social groups that we're talking about, how do you bake into the tech design the diverse needs and claims of people into these public services? Because one is talking about so many different people sitting at the edges, at the margins. And what in your experience becomes really important if you have to really address these specificities?
Yes, and so really this tags right along with what Gert was just saying, and Emmeline as well, and the other panelists. But really, it's about the design. When you are designing a technical solution, you really you have to first and foremost build that trust. And so especially in health and human services, when people come to you in need and they need things, we know these processes are tedious. We know that they are laborsome. They take lots of hours to apply for, for a benefit. It requires documentation. It's a little bit of an overwhelming process. And if we consider that, those individuals coming forth are probably in some sort of experiencing a crisis of some sort. Again, they've lost their job. Maybe they're going through some mental health issues. Maybe there's an illness in the family, whatever it might be, they're already coming to us a little bit fragile. So when we create that, those solutions and we design, we want to make sure we instill trust that the process is safe, that their information that they provide, the documents, the data they provide is, will be held in, for that purpose. We found, when we did design research, it really matters what kind of language you use. And we got direct feedback from end users of saying the language you chose to use actually made us feel more comfortable. It wasn't the high level government language. It didn't sound real legalistic. It wasn't, if you don't provide this, then we don't want to work with you, which is kind of the way they feel intimidated with, language that maybe is a higher level than they, that they understand. So really when, come to the table, kind of to wrap this up, some real simple things would be simplify the language. Typically we like to design on a 12-year-old level, and not to say our, the clients, aren't brighter than that, but again, they're coming in crisis. And so we really need to keep that language simple, maybe at a 12-year-old understanding level, not that typical government language. They really appreciate when you can infuse language such as, here's how we're protecting your identity, or here's how we're protecting this information. And also, to reduce their time spent on applications is, let's go ahead and fill in information we already know about them. Don't make them start from, on page 1 of 10-page application and put in their name and their address and their, phone number for the third time for the third benefit that they're referring to. So those are all things that you can use to improve that experience.
Thanks for that very granular kind of delineation. I'd like to turn to Wietse because he did make a reference to the COVID context, and I want to pick up from there and talk about certain hard-hitting things that we need to understand about the intersections between technology and society. I think we've lived through certain very surreal times, and Wietse, you would agree that inclusive governance has become a real challenge now with so much inequality. So I'd like to ask you, what have we learned about the challenges in tech design for inclusive governance? And maybe we should really put that on the table, because it's really not okay to speak in abstractions.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the question. I think I first of all want to reiterate what's been said by Emmeline, Leah, and Gert in terms of inclusion, and what Leah was saying about the design process. That's, I think, a first important element, designing together with the end user, with residents and community members of all age groups, of all different backgrounds. It's something that we do very proactively to make sure that the design is inclusive. But actually having only the design to be inclusive is not enough, because as Emmeline put forward, having digital access is a prerequisite before being able to participate. So I would definitely say that is a major challenge, especially these days during COVID, when everything got digital. Normally our approach would be, all right, we blend online and offline, but it's not always feasible these days. So that's a major, I would also say, open question that is still to be answered in the coming years. But next to the question of digital inclusion, I want to also maybe, talk a bit more broadly about where we are when we look at participatory and inclusive governance at large. And from my experience, what we've seen over the past years is 5 years ago, we were actually having a conversation about what is the value of participatory democracy and participatory governance. Now it looks like everybody agrees on the value, and that we have clearly been through this paradigm shift. And now the question is, how are we going to do that? And then what's really important as well is the capacity building. We work especially with governments, but civil servants and political leaders are not entirely adapted yet to this new reality. It's a new way of actually making political decisions. And that's why we need a lot of education. We need a lot of capacity building, sharing knowledge between different governments to prepare for this. And then there's one thing I want to highlight there, what we've seen that is really important to get people engaged, is giving feedback. And it's something that overall governments are not always well adapted to. When citizens take the time to actually participate and to engage with their government and with each other, then what's really important is that they feel heard, that they know that their input has been taken into account. So that's why it's really important to also have transparency on the process. What are the different steps in the participatory process? When can I expect feedback? And after all, how has my input impacted the final decision? So these are a couple of learnings on what we really pay attention to.
Yeah, thank you so much. So Emmeline, we are up on time, but your wisdom is very, very important in this regard. And I'd like to request you to speak to maybe 2 principles that are needed to ensure that the present and future of this digitally mediated governance, how can we ensure social justice and equity, globally? So maybe 2 principles.
Thank you. I'd like to highlight the principle of human rights-based and people-centered approach, which comes from the development effectiveness perspective. But in addition to that, I think I just re-emphasized my point earlier, how small we are and very communal. Relationship is key. And we live in a very small society where we know each other. We know, and so when it comes to that kind of strong, connected, we often find that when it comes to good governance, we are silent sometimes to highlight some of the bad practices, some of the corrupted practices that we see happening, because we are so connected, we are so related. And so I think this is where the challenges that we face if we are moving into an online, and I really like the idea shared by the others in terms of the co-designing of what's the best solution for us, considering all the different contexts, and context is very important. But at the same time, I think I would like to also highlight the key in terms of social accountability. how we hold each other accountable in terms of being in the room, being with everybody, and then you tend to engage, and you have that whole mutual accountability where you hold each other by just being around. Where online platform are often give way to some of those practices to go unnoticed because you feel like that no one will see what you're doing, and a lot of things are under the current. But I think that is really our experience from our Pacific. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, for calling out the need for human rights, co-design, and accountability. I think these really are important takeaways. I'd like now to hand over to Monica so that we can begin and open up the question answer process.
Yes, thank you so much. So I will bring on stage two NGO representatives now, Daniel Perel and Dr. Ifi, so that they can ask their question to the panel. Go ahead, Daniel.
Good morning, afternoon, and evening, everyone. And thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity. This, I think, is exactly the kind of conversation we need. I particularly appreciate that each of you are trying to ensure that innovation is able to be suited to the needs of your respective communities through processes of inclusive design, implementation, and evaluation, and that you've managed to bring forward a number of different perspectives, the private sector, national government, local community. It's been really excellent. And in that sense, my question is the following. Since we're having this conversation alongside a UN space, a global governance space, what do you see as the role of global governance for this? Should it be a standard-setting body to help create minimums of participation, transparency, and bias? Is it a place of learning where experiences can be shared and disseminated, and if so, how? And this especially in light of the mismatch between the rapid pace of innovation at the very local level and then the slow machine of global governance. How do we square that circle, and what role for the UN or other international bodies in this sense? And thank you again.
Thank you, Dan. We will go next with Dr. Ifi's question, and then Ms. Orapin's question, and then the panelists will be able to pick the question they want to answer to. Dr. Ifi, please.
Okay, thank you so much, Monica. My name is Dr. Ifi from Worldwide Network, Nigeria. Thank you all for your beautiful presentation. If you recall, during the opening video for this particular session, one of the ladies talked about violence against women and girls. And that struck a chord, with me, because this is the area we are working on. So in addition to the consequences of COVID-19, you will agree with me that there was an increase in the rate of violence against women. My question here is there any type of ICT-based applications or digital services or program that would enable us to facilitate the integration of rural women and girls, and also to end gender-based violence and build support for survivors? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ifi. We will go with the next question from Ms. Orapin.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you for the very interesting presentations. My question is, in terms of good governance, many countries start from people participation, to get citizens engaged in government policies, stuff like that. But I think it's very important and a challenge to look at another side of the citizen engagement, which is in terms of government transparency. How can we get digital technologies to monitor and keep the government performance in light of good governance principle? And another challenging question is, whether the government or the public organization willing to open up, for the, to provide information to the citizen.
Thank you, Orapin. Anita, the floor is back to you for your panelist.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think we have interesting questions there, and I request the panelists to come in and answer either or all. We do have some time, so please go ahead. I invite my panelists to respond.
I'm absolutely would love to address, Dr. Iffy, your question. My heart as well goes to, obviously, during this time, especially now more than ever, when people are staying at home, but the escalation of violence against children and women. And I don't know that there necessarily is one solution that I would want to point to necessarily without knowing full things, but I will assure you that conversations are taking place and solutions are being looked into as we look at how can we provide that support for survivors, but even more so, let's back it up. How can we identify more readily, since we're not putting our eyes on children as often in a public setting, or women are not out of their homes as often, to be able to reach out for support. And so really, in the early stages is really, and I think shows some promise, is looking at the data. I know at IBM, there's a huge effort that has created sort of all of the data is collected by several hundreds of NGOs and put in one space. And so the data is now available to be analyzed. And by data, I mean, information about circumstance, the data that's collected when it's identified, what circumstances are victims in, where, when do they seek help? What are the patterns of, for say, perpetrators, human traffickers they're trying to identify vulnerable populations to recruit. And so that data is being analyzed, and actually some real insights coming out of it. And it is causing, the response of what are, putting the programs in place at an NGO level of, here's how we can provide more prevention services. And then of course, on the other side of it, the support for the survivors. So, and it's so important, again, going back to design very quickly, is the, design of solutions. We have to keep them in mind. I know in the United States, it's very popular these days to have like a camera at your front door and to be able to, punch your code in to enter and exit your house. Well, the designers of that technology never really thought about the fact that abusers use that against their victims, and keep them in the house even more. So, that's just one tiny example of why it's so important for us as professionals to magnify the voices of those in need and bring those voices to the table, either directly or it's our voice advocating on their behalf when we design solutions.
Wietse, would you like to take that question on monitoring, the one that was asked last?
Yeah, absolutely. So on the last question, I think on monitoring and information, the first step is that we open up data on policies, on political decisions. So that's, I think, a first very important step, that we digitize the data. A lot is still, like, in terms of political decisions, and a lot of information is still either closed or in dusty archives in old PDFs and those kind of formats. So digitizing the data is, I think, a very first important step, but that's definitely not going to be enough, because to give like one concrete example, a council decision is something really interesting for residents. There's a lot of value in that information, but if you would just share, like the report of a council meeting, it's very boring. So I believe that we need a layer in between. We need to translate this towards citizens in a comprehensive way, in an easy to understand language, and also, focus more on visualization. So I believe that governments in the future will see more people actually in these roles, in communication roles, to really make that translation towards citizens and make it more comprehensible. I would also maybe quickly like to respond to the first question, Anita, on global governance. I thought it was an excellent question, and one with a lot of potential in the future. Before COVID, or like 5 years ago, 10 years ago, it was unthinkable that we would have a global dialogue. These days, it's so easy to connect. I mean, if you just look at this webinar, people from all over the world, and to have a conversation, we have interpretation into different languages. So it just enables us to have many more seats around the same table and discuss key topics such as climate, which is really a global issue. That's one thing, but secondly, to come with a concrete proposal, something that I'm really a big fan of is this idea of the Global Citizens Initiative for the UN, that just as we have it in Europe for the European Citizens Initiative, that we could also have that on a global scale, and that citizens across the world could actually collaborate on issues, bring them to the table, put them on the agenda, gather a minimum number of signatures, and that way also mobilize their communities to discuss key topics worldwide. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to turn to Gert. And of course, I think it's a great provocation to start your response with on, imagining the world with citizens of the world, sitting around, in a global democracy. Over to you, Gert.
Thank you very much. Perhaps building on first a little bit on what Vita was just referring to, and answering this last question on the privacy aspect of this all. Well, the way how this is handled in Europe is through the GDPR, and in my own country we have a Personal Data Act. So through legislation to provide this safety net for the people. And we have also created a digital solution for this, which is called a Personal Data Monitor. So every single citizen can monitor who, when, and why has accessed their data. In a digitized governance, in a digitized system, there is always a trail, and this trail is visible. And we in our country have created a system for the citizens to have that access, to see whether a doctor, a notary public, a police officer, or whoever has looked at my data. So again, I come back to this electronic identity. Every Estonian has a unique electronic identity. So, for example, when I drive my car, I don't have to have my driver's license with me, because the police officer stopping me can immediately access their database from their police patrol vehicle and see whether I have a driver's license. So it's not a question of whether I have that piece of plastic or paper with me, but rather whether I have passed the exam and have not had any fines, or my driving license has not been suspended. So they need to be able to identify me, but I don't have to have that piece of paper with me. I can have my ID card, my passport, any other identity document with me. And now when this interaction happens, they are accessing my data. And so when I go home 2 weeks later, I can see that, yes, on this date, that police officer there accessed my data. And I'm like, okay, yes, that's fine. But if I wasn't stopped by police that day and they access my data, then immediately for me, it's the question, why? I mean, I haven't done anything. So I can submit a question, an inquiry, and there will be a formal inquiry. And if they broke the law while doing this, then that person, that official, will either be fined or suspended, because is not supposed to look at that data. And now coming back to the first question, and the global governance, and how the UN can tackle this. We, Estonia, have signed a cooperation agreement with the UNDP, where we have sort of provided our example, a solution, a toolbox, if you may, to third countries to use if they wish so, and of course tailor make it to their needs on how to get these systems operable. So it's our interest that everyone would be digital. Thank you very much.
Emily, do you want to add to any of what has already been said?
Thank you. I want to have a quick touch on the global governance. And this is related to our Pacific when it comes to COVID-19. The perspective of self-determinations. And if you have time to look into our Pacific community in countries, we are far away, and I think that we are being privileged to better manage COVID-19 in our end of the world. But you will find that we have a number of countries that are really, really bad. Guam, because they are still under the influence of the US, New Caledonia by France, and West Papua by Indonesia. Those are the countries that are really badly affected, because they cannot even make decisions on their own to shut down their borders. And I think this is where the global governance will need to look into in terms of how do we deal with governance in a broader democracy perspective. And I think this is really still an issue for some of our countries in our region, and civil society are really still concerned about those things when you can't even make the decision. Your citizens can't even make the decisions to for the safety of your community, of your people, if you are still under the influence of foreign powers. I like the idea of the data and online, how we can use that to better address violence against women. In terms of reporting, how do we use that to amplify the voices of those that are being impacted? But we also recognize that some of the policies that we need to have in terms of responsible use of the internet, for example, because some of those violence are being triggered in some cases by the irresponsible use of internet by different partners. And the last one is I still feel like that in our region that online governance is still treated as a technical solutions. We still have not had the time to socialize that so that our citizens are able to use it in a way. And probably one of the things that we have to recognize that it should always be accompanied by some form of education awareness in terms of how do you make sure that your citizens are better able to use it. It's not no use having a system and no one is really able to use it. Really, thank you for the opportunity to have the Pacific Voices had in this platform.
We are very, very grateful for the voices from the Pacific to be represented here. Thank you, Emmeline. We have 15 more minutes, and I would like to suggest to Monica that if there are organizations, individuals from organizations who would like to speak up, it's always a pleasure to have the digitally mediated face-to-face interactions. Otherwise, I'm happy to read questions.
Yeah, we have a few questions in the Q&A box that I will read for you, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
So we have one question from Lara Chiavarini, who says, her question is directed to Vitse, and she says that his initiative is great, but how can it be implemented in communities where not everyone has access to internet? For instance, in Argentina, we have over 40% of poverty, and therefore many people would be left behind. And we can combine this question with a question asked by Mohammed, also in the Q&A box, asking Widze if his app is available in developing countries, and specifically in Africa, and if yes, which countries? So that's a first set of questions. I would also like to read the question of Sylvia Nane, who is asking to everyone on the panel if anybody has experience with the use of artificial intelligence in e-government. She says, I think that we must start to think about the legal and ethical use of AI on this topic and the impact of democracy. And I would like to combine this question with another question talking about specifically the issue of fake news and how to regulate this new topic that are arising. Thank you.
Yes, over to you, Vitse.
Thank you. Really good questions. Let's start with the first one on like, yeah, digital participation in let's say in Africa and in global South. Well, today we have mainly worked, so as I said in introduction, work with over 200 governments. Majority of them, I mean, the very large majority are in Europe and the United States, but we do work in Latin America, and we have a couple of use cases also in Africa, in South Africa and Kenya. And we have indeed discovered, I mean, we have very rapidly seen that there are limitations to the fact that not everybody has, of course, digital access. So something that we're currently working on is participation via feature phones, via SMS. it's something that we don't have in place, but that for us looks like one possible alternative to like desktop or smartphone participation. But obviously then I want to also re-emphasize that we need online and offline possibilities together. Today it's a bit more difficult given the situation, but those are some initial steps. But I must admit that we're also very much still in the learning process, and that we're also happy to engage with you after this call if you have ideas or things, projects that you might want to discuss. Very happy to talk about it. I want to also quickly address maybe the second question on artificial intelligence, because I think it's also a very relevant one, something that we are currently working on, and where we are facing the first question on ethics is the processing of the data. So once you've collected a lot of input, a lot of ideas from your residents, we're talking about thousands of ideas here, then obviously you don't want to process that in an Excel spreadsheet row per row, because that's going to take you weeks or months. So we're using algorithms to cluster similar inputs and to actually generate these reports. And there, an initiative that we're taking is we're going to open source the algorithms to make sure that it's clear how it works, that it's accessible. Obviously, that is not enough. We're also going to document that. But just to kind of second to echo what you said in your question, or what was in your question, that we really need transparency on this and openness on this. And maybe a very quick last comment on the third question is on fake news. I just want to stress there the importance of also having institutionalized platforms for digital democracy, to not only rely on social media platforms for the public sphere, but to bring our digital sphere also in institutionalized platforms, because we see way less spam, we see way less trolls, and I believe that is really an important step in having constructive, deliberative debates that are the antidote to all that polarization that we see on channels like Facebook and Twitter. Thank you.
Yeah, I think these questions are very, very important, because Vitse's pointed out to positive uses of AI in being able to understand the feedback loop and understand what really is the pulse of citizen experiences. But I think the question from Sylvia also comes in the context of non-transparency and the black box that AI is. And it would be interesting to hear from the experiences of others, maybe Gert, particularly on how is this kind of openness to citizen audit, and it also goes back to some of the other questions that have come up, particularly from Nandini. How do you ensure that even when the private sector is involved, the essential principles of democratic governance, are not lost sight of? Gert, if you might take that question.
Thank you very much. That's a difficult question, but I'll try my best to provide an answer. On AI, I can't delve thoroughly into this as I'm not an expert on the matter. What I can say is that we have a task force set together within the Prime Minister's office to study the issue, and people are working on it. And you start with baby steps, and the first baby steps, of course, in any decent government are legislation and how to regulate the hell out of this before we delve into the practicalities of it. And the practical example is, once we start using in real life, I mean, they are used somewhat now, these driverless buses and driverless taxis or driverless cars. If that gets into an accident, whose fault is it? Who is responsible? Sort of these discussions are where we started engaging this issue, but it's of course much wider and much broader, and there's a lot to it. But this is a discussion on its own, and I would need to be better prepared for this. With regard to your question on the public-private partnership and the democracy aspect being still relevant there, I mean, we utilize a system, for example, and again, I come back to legislation. We use a system which is called e-consultation. So every single legal act that is being discussed before it's adopted is put on consultation between all state institutions, but also private people can engage in the discussion and provide their feedback and viewback. And this is sort of an option on how to engage the wider populace in these decision-making processes, at least get the opinion there. So that's one option of how to do this. And I'll stop there. If there's any further questions, happy to answer.
Leah, would you like to take any of those questions on AI,
absolutely.
perhaps? Yes.
Yeah, that's, I was going to say, first I would like to just put out there, obviously, when you mention AI, a lot of different things come to mind for every person. And so what I would like to lay the groundwork for is that, you know, the discussions on ethics and AI have already been in existence for years now. So I know IBM has a very strong point of view. It's been researched. It's been, you know, I mean, we're very much involved and very public and transparent about how important it is to develop and use technology responsibly. So that's out there. I know I was in New Zealand a couple of years ago, and their government as well is publishing reports on how they are going to leverage artificial intelligence within their government. And so again, it's for ethical, I guess you could say, for ethical people, they want to address all of the concerns about AI. It's not the answer to everything. It's, you know, it's not something you use everywhere. And if I could give an example of that, working in child welfare for many years, I understand how important it is to make quick decisions based on the information you have at the time. I know one example of artificial intelligence, and some companies are doing okay with it, but for me personally wouldn't be comfortable. It's predicting the risk that a child would be abused. And so basically what they're doing is collecting data from, you know, all of the reporting data, all of the data that's available. And they're saying, okay, based on all of this data, we predict that, you know, this child in this living situation at this income level, you know, is likely to be abused. And some agencies are choosing to use that information as part of their decision-making to remove children. For me, I feel like that's way too risky. There are hundreds of other, what we call use cases, or hundreds of other instances where you can apply AI that's not putting a person's livelihood and their lives at risk. For example, I actually published a paper last year, right before we ever even really were using the word pandemic on a daily basis. And it was a perspective of what's the future of work and social services. And in that paper, if you're interested, it's quite lengthy, but very well researched. And you know, to be able to use AI and automation in maybe perhaps workflows for workers, case workers that are trying to make a difference in people's lives. How about we look at the processes that they're you know, manually burdensome, you know, the things where they have to write down notes in a home, but then go back to a computer at the office and type those same notes into the system. Or what about, you know, as I mentioned earlier, the duplication of you have to write a name and phone number and income information 6 times on the same case. And it's just duplicative information. How about we look at some of those processes and apply that artificial intelligence and maybe those automated workflows and allow it to take sort of those tasks that don't need to be made by a human, have it completed by, you know, sort of that artificial intelligence. And then always, I say, always bring it back to a worker to say, yes, you've gotten this right, or no, you've gotten it, you know, you've not gotten it right. Because the beauty of AI or artificial intelligence is that it learns with time. So it needs to have our human input to be able to design it. So again, leaving on the, you know, wrapping this up is, you know, we're already ahead of the game. A lot of governments, I think, are already looking at how AI impact the delivery of services. And I think there are some very relevant use cases out there that can be started with that are less risky, and it can also free up caseworkers' time so that they can have more face-to-face time with their highest need clients. So hopefully that answers your question. Feel free to reach out if there's any other clarifications.
Yes. Thank you so much. If you could plug in those papers in the chat window, I think there will be many of us who are interested. So Leah, request you do. Emmeline, I want to come back to you because you're reminding us consistently that the world is not flat. And I think that it's a very important consideration for the design of governance systems, which go back to a new foundation in digital technologies, for us to rethink frameworks of accountability and transparency. You did refer to the context that, we are not looking at, absolute sovereign states. There are complexities. We live in a globalized world where there is the political economy of international development. I'd really like to start in the last few minutes of the discussion and, coax the speakers to take on this question of accountability and transparency, right? Because it can come in from various angles, and I've just gone through the questions and the chat window coming from various participants here. There's always this feeling that when technology comes in, there is a certain distancing. And of course, many, many new actors coming in, because governments cannot, for instance, process AI on their own. So you have private actors getting in. And then there is that entire legal machinery that may be absent, which stipulates what ethical processes are required to be complied with mandatorily within the online governance system. So Emmeline, over to you. And then I would like to request everybody to take a couple of minutes to ponder over the central question for democratic governance, which is about transparency and accountability.
Thank you, Anita, and I think the rest of the panelists have touched based on that. And one of the things that we have to really remind ourselves is that whatever that our government is putting out to improve the services is really for the people. And so what are the different level of accessibility, for example, understanding the level of awareness, the level of educations that our populations in our society has need to be considered. Because if you're looking into artificial intelligence that we just heard, looking forward to read the study that Leah was referring to. In some of our small community, it would really be just a cost additional, because the two systems will still continue to run parallel to each other, where we'll still be looking at the government introducing online system, and those of us that are not access to those technology will still have to write things down on paper and still go to the office and type that up again the next day. Yeah. So how do we make sure that it's not just a wave that we're trying to have a journey because everybody else is having it, to really look into. And when we're talking about data with online technology, it will really improve how we manage the information and how we analyze that. And it's no point of doing that unless it's inform the decision making of our leaders in terms of how we see social challenges that we face being addressed by the public services that are produced. But we also have to make sure as well that it doesn't become the online tools doesn't become like a data mining kind of thing where you go out and collect data from everybody and you don't have the responsibility of accountable for it, where most of the face-to-face that we see now are recognizing those ethical values of where you go interview, you go back and report or explain to people what you have done with those data, where it will be a totally different world if you are using the online facilities where there's much more open, much more to use data to whatever that we have. And we, from our region, we still have lack of policies in place to manage that. And so we are really looking at some of the argument that people are now, and because you don't know enough about it, there's a whole lot of fear of people who are not familiar to adapt to it. And so there's another level of people that are kind of withdrawing from some of the services that the government are introducing that could have helped improve services just because of not understanding how things works. And some of those future of work implicated as well, where a lot of our people are kind of withdraw from learning new skills just by fear of some of the thinking that technology will take their jobs. In majority of our small populations, government is the main employer. And so some of those challenges need to be further unpacked. It's not just a pure thinking that, you know, online will serve the, you know, the solution for our government just because we see that it's helping more transparent because everyone will access to that and the whole accountability. There will be more feedback loop available facilities. The citizen auditing will be in a better position because you can, you know, have apps that you can make public submissions and all that kind of thing. No, it's far deeper than how we engage our citizen. And I think the topic around technology linking to participatory governance and democracy is just a good platform to start having. And Leah was really related to that. Let's have the conversation. And I hope that this is not the last of that conversation. We'll continue to have much more and probably take this home and have those conversations back in your own country. Thank you.
Yes, many, many profound ideas to take away there. Ever so grateful to you. I'd like to move on to the wisdom of the others to speak to this question about accountability. You know, Gert, how does one build that trust? How does one eliminate fear, you know, that Emmeline was talking about? And how do we make sure that when we talk about digitally mediated delivery of public services and citizenship, we are actually talking about a balance of power where the citizen feels empowered and not exploited?
Thank you very much. Good questions, and it has been a super interesting discussion. The whole organization of yours. I'm very happy that you put it together this way, and that you created exactly this panel to have all of these different angles represented here. So one aspect of this question that I would immediately address would be the sort of the accountability element, and I would perhaps refer to it as such that touch upon the question of corruption. I mean, corruption, if you think about it, the states or the countries worldwide where you hear a lot of about problems with corruption, where it's in the media, someone was arrested for this or that being corrupt. I mean, these are not countries that have a problem with corruption. Countries that have a problem with corruption is where you hear nothing, where there is no such news ever. These countries where you hear these kind of things, that means that someone is dealing with this. That means that the law enforcement is working, the judiciary is working. And online services, online decision-making, online governments, like I referred to before, there is always a trail. Computers in that sense do not lie. It's impossible to hide this trail. The trail is there, it's visible, and by itself, this creates the trust, this creates the option. It is much more easier to go manually to someone's office and manually take a piece of paper and manually do something on it. There is no trail. If you do the same thing via a digital database, there is always a trail, and there is always this accountability element that can be accessed through there. Now, the other important thing that this would work is what you said before, is the transparency aspect of it. That, I mean, you need to be able to educate the population on how you can look at this data and what are the options, what is the legislation, how is this regulated. So in my eyes and in my country's experience over the past few decades, I still strongly argue for the fact that digital is an opportunity. It is a solution. It is an opportunity to make things better, more convenient, more transparent, the ease of use. etc., etc. And to answer the some of the questions that Emelina raised, yes, of course, there are tasks that that in this new world will be computerized. There are jobs that will cease to exist in the next 5 decades or so. And the option what the governments can do in this, and also the wider civil society, is to help with the retraining of people into areas where human touch, human element is essential to carry that work forward. So it is something that where we all need to sort of pull together and address together and see what the options are. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for bringing, as they would say, the human back into the loop. So then maybe a last minute's reflection from both Wietse and Leah, and then I can wrap up.
Sure. I've loved this conversation. I think it's fantastic. And I think that we live in a very exciting time. We are representative here as bridging that gap between a lifetime where no technology was ever talked about and everything was manual in our professions, to bridging that gap to where we're pretty much going to be going to, moving into that digital world. As a matter of fact, I just read an article this morning with that, the highlight of the accelerated pace of digital transformation, and how it really highlighted the fact that for governments that it's going to just take off from here. We've got remote work situations. We need solutions for contactless services. We've got, public sector leaders that are really looking to meet the needs of their citizens that are struggling so much as a result. And so we're just, we are the means by which this conversation can happen, and that we can bring to light, Emily had mentioned, the fears that are out there, or maybe, the misinformation, or even more so just educating. There's so much to talk about. And we are the voices that need to bring it together. Wietse had mentioned, we've got this online platform now, and we can connect globally. And so let's use what we've got now to just have these conversations. I know I'm very positive and peppy. I always get that feedback, but I'm not overlooking. My panelists brought up to light, obviously, some very real concerns about having technology in the space of human services. Those are things, to me, they're real. They're absolutely real, but let's talk about them. I think for so long, many of us just cowered away from them, thinking this is not going to work. We work with people. We need to do people work on our own. But the fact is, we need technology sometimes to complement what we do, free us up to do those higher value tasks that really make a difference in people's lives. But we've got to start with conversation. We've got to bring that representation to the table and into those conversations. And I will honestly say, working for a company, an IT company, I could not tell you more excited people to want to solution than those that have those technical minds. And so we need each other. They're super excited, come with solutions all the time, but it also takes our part to come to the table and say, let's talk about this because this may not be ethical in this sense, or this might not be the best use case. Let's talk about it in a different manner. So we need each other to really catapult this forward.
So we'd say you started off and, with your reflections, and you also get the last word. So go.
Thank you. I would, as a last message, I would say, I would address you all as citizens. I think in the coming years, we're going to see more and more opportunities to participate. And I would say, let's remain also critical about what we're asked to participate on. So that it's not just tokenistic, because I think that's also what we're going to see more and more. And to avoid that would be a participation fatigue. I would, just say, like, let's make participatory democracy meaningful and fun to participate. There needs to be stake for citizens. And to bring that back and to close the loop on transparency and accountability, we need a lot of feedback loops from government. We need to know how actually our input has affected the final decision making. And participatory processes, we need to be able to engage early enough in the process. So I think that would be some kind of key messages I would want to share with you for the future.
Okay, I was not completely honest when I said you will have the last word, because I think I'm going to take my 2 minutes now. So I wanted to draw the attention of everybody here to the Civil Society Declaration that was circulated and that's up there on the NGO Committee's website. It's called A Socially Just Transition to Sustainable Development, the Role of Digital Technology in the Well-Being of All. And I think that there are a couple of things that are said in the Civil Society Declaration that was underlined very beautifully today. And I want to talk about one exhortation, which is to support technology transfer to developing countries, And I think Emmeline also underscored the need to think about how the capabilities, the capacities of countries to stand up for their own vision of digital design can actually be accomplished. And I think that question ties back to global cooperation and international development cooperation. So I think the foundational infrastructure for good governance and a public goods approach to technologies for deepening democracy really requires us to think in a concerted way at the global level for what we are going to do about countries that need to rapidly digitalize in a way that can make space for citizen rights. The second thing I'd like to really highlight is the ideas in the declaration which provide a caution that we do need to provide digital access to social protection services for all individuals and families so that we go back to the basics of social development. We go back to the basics of economic development. Food, water, housing, energy, healthcare, transportation are available to all. And here I think what Emmeline kept saying, which is that for people to understand that the digital can work for them, sometimes they need to be very sure that the older systems are also present. That's because they are not simply connected to the grid, they're not networked. And so at some level, I think there is a need to understand that in our quest for a digital fundamentalism, we don't really ignore the fact that there are people who are excluded, whose rights to access these basic needs and rights whose rights are excluded. And therefore, there has to be a way of connecting people back into governance, even if they are not connected digitally. So in that sense, I think the principles that were spoken of today, including the design of AI, are not necessarily design principles for the technology. They are design principles for accountable governance. So I'd like to end there and remind everybody here about something that Emmeline said, which is that democracy was not built on an app. So I think if that's one message that we can take away, I think we would have thought a little bit about well-being and the connection between well-being and digital technologies. Thank you very much. Over to you, Monica. I think you wanted to administer a quiz. So over to the organizers.
Thank you so much, Anita, and to all the panelists. We will go with the poll now, and that will be our last action for today. So you are welcome to vote on this poll. And we see the voting starting. Unfortunately, I think our panelists cannot vote. You can just look at the results. This is for our attendees to vote. So the question is, how should civil society react to the monopolization of digital power by large multinational corporations? Answer A is advocate for stricter regulation at government level. Answer B is advocate for multinationals to strengthen corporate social responsibility efforts. Question C is leave it up to the multinational corporation to regulate themselves. So let's see, we have 50% of the audience who voted already. Let's wait a little bit more to get up to at least 75% of people answering. Okay, so it looks like the majority is going for advocate for stricter regulation at government level. So this is what our audience is telling us on this question. So now you see the poll result coming up with 57% for response A and 41% on corporate social responsibility efforts and 3% for the last one. I think we have a second poll coming up. Can we have the second poll coming up? Yes, perfect. And this will be our second and last question of the day. Do you believe the digitalization of all public records and public services to be a service offered by government for greater transparency? So it looks like we will have an overwhelming response for yes, and the importance of greater transparency in the digitalization of all public records and public services. Thank you so much to all the respondents. And with that, we will, yes, perfect. Thank you. You can see the result here with overwhelming 76% for a big yes. So thank you again so much for joining us on this panel. I invite you all to join us to the closing session that will happen tomorrow at 10 a.m. EST. Thank you.
Thank you. It was an honor to be here.
Thank you, moderator.
Thank you, Anita. Thank you, panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.